Hi guys, and welcome back to History 240. So before we get started, I need to clear up a couple of housekeeping things real quick. First and foremost, it turns out that we are just a smidge behind. So we took a little bit of a detour last week in talking about some of the developments facing the United States going into the 20th century. And technically, it was not supposed to be taught for this section of this course. It's just so much more fun than going into the 20s and just having no idea what's going on, and populism and progressivism, and having no idea what other developments are going on. We've almost solely talked about politics and that kind of stuff coming up to this point, and that last lecture was really just to give you guys something else to hold on to that was just a little bit more fun. The thing about history is that it's not solely about politics, but the way that this course is set up is that it's largely based around politics. So I have to give you all of the politics and that kind of stuff, but you don't get to see any of the developmental side of Kentucky culture coming up. So I just kind of threw that in there. Just to kind of give you guys a little something to hold on to. We're going to have to go back to politics today. So the plan is for this week and next week, we're going to get you guys caught up. So for this week, the assignment that's due, you guys should have something due having to do with the 1920s and the Depression here coming up. You're going to have Chapter 8 that's due, is my understanding. And then you'll have one more time with me, and then we'll have a test on the week of the 29th, and it will be due Sunday. So again, like last time, people, places, and terms. That's the entire test right there. It's just people, places, and terms. So make sure you guys start studying your people, places, and terms now. So that way when we actually get to the test, hopefully you guys will have that down pat enough that you guys will be able to just zoom through the test and have it over and done with. So we'll cover the Depression next week, and we'll get started into the Depression next week, and that should put you guys at a pretty good spot, because we're going to discuss populism and progressivism tonight, and then from there, the only other thing that we have to do is just cover the Depression, and I'm hoping we can get all of that covered next week. That's my goal. Fingers crossed. So let's go ahead and get started into the lecture. So we've only got about 4 slides to cover this evening, but there's a ton of information on those slides. We've got 2 that are meh, slim, and then 2 that are just absolutely massive, especially the Black Patch War. The Black Patch War, just in and of itself, is kind of a complicated thing, but it'll help you to understand a little bit about what's going on and why Kentucky is in such a rough state as we go into the Depression. So just as a note to you guys, something that is incredibly important for you to understand is that prior to the United States going into the official Depression, Kentucky itself is already in an economic decline. And when we go into the Depression, you'll see that just be exacerbated to the point where many Kentuckians have a really difficult time bouncing back. And we'll see this going into the 40s, the 50s. This doesn't go away for a long time. So let's go to the political side of this, and then we'll make it back to the Black Patch War. And as we progress through tonight's course, you'll have, hopefully by the time we're finished, a better understanding of the kind of economic and political issues that we're facing in Kentucky. So let's go to populism. So populism is a movement that can be defined as a coalition or a gathered group of people, of agrarian reformers, so people who are dealing with farming in the Midwest and the South. And this is primarily taking place at the end of the 1800s. So what they're doing is that they're pushing for local farmers' alliances, who are essentially discontented farming groups, who come together and push for reform. And a lot of this is leading back to economic collapses that we talked about last week, in the late 1800s, and the fact that agricultural prices are just plummeting. And so as we look at these, you might think, oh, this sounds a lot like unions. And we're starting to see some of that union development, but essentially the Farmers Alliance just is completely ineffective on a national scale. And so with this, you'll see continued economic depressions and continued economic issues, especially in the farming areas within Kentucky. So these kind of sad economic conditions are just aggravated by different systems of farming in Kentucky that are just falling apart. So essentially, Kentucky was built up on three types of economic farming. So you've got the plantation system, sharecropping, and cropland systems. So plantation system, you guys have all heard of. Sharecropping is where you have a large plot of land, and this happens a lot after the Civil War, is where you'll have a lot of land, and you'll take that land and you'll divide it up. And as you're dividing it up, the person who gets a piece of land will pay the owner of the plot of land rent. And what that person will do for that little tiny piece of land is they'll take it and they'll divide that piece up. And then the people who go to live on that section of land will pay the initial renter rent. And then they'll pay the person who owns the land. And so they just kind of get tinier and tinier little divisions within this one plot of land that will kind of go along and will go to paying a person who has a larger plot of land. And you can see in this picture up here on the right hand side a group of sharecroppers. These are mostly the just outrageously impoverished people, and former slaves, people who are just economically devastated post-Civil War. Now, I'm trying to think of a good way to describe cropland systems. I'm sure that all of you guys have heard of a lien on property. So you've got somebody who goes into debt, and with that debt, they may take a piece of your property and say, when that piece of property goes up for sale, eventually, I get some of the money from that sale. So crop liens are essentially where someone goes into debt and they promise to pay back that debt from the sale of a crop. So it's a crop that's not grown yet. It's not been harvested yet. And so the amount that people are going to get to live off of under this cropland system and under the sharecropping system are going to just kind of shrink incomes progressively over time. So with the cropland system, let's say a person in Kentucky makes about, at this time, $2,000 a year. Well, let's say they borrow $500, and then they have a crop that ends up being worth $1,000. So they're going to lose half their income just paying back this debt from the year before, and they're going to have progressively less money to spend over time. So starting in about 1882, you'll have these Farmers Alliance leaders organize under the Populist Party, who becomes the People's Party. They just call themselves the People's Party. the attempt to include labor unions, social reformers overall, but they remain largely agrarian, so largely based around farming communities. Their political goals are to help agrarian society have a greater political voice. So they're wanting farmers to be heard in the government and have it be equal to business and industry. So kind of like I mentioned that it kind of sounds a lot like a union, but it's not a union. But it kind of functions in largely the same way, and they'll try to pull in some of those union ties in trying to get the industrial sector in. It doesn't work well, but they try. And so with this, they'll start asking for an increase in circulating currency, which means that they'll just start minting silver and gold and continue printing money. And so the dollar will continually become less in worth. So essentially they're trying to increase, no, I'm saying that wrong. They're trying to have the dollar be worth less when they're paying back their debt, if that makes sense. So essentially, let's say you've got a loan for $500 and you want to decrease the value of the dollar so that you're paying back your debt faster. So they're essentially trying to print more money, make the dollar worth less, and then try to pay back their debt in that way. And this doesn't work either because it's completely backwards to what it sounds like it should be. So if you increase the worth of the dollar, then when you go to pay back your debt, then it would make sense that you would pay back your debt faster. But essentially they're saying, okay, we've got this amount of money that we owe the bank. It's $500. So we're going to give them cheaper dollars so that we're not paying them back quite as much. I'm not entirely sure how that's supposed to work, but that's essentially what they're getting at. They want a graduated income tax. So as a side note, they want a graduated income tax. So basically what they want is today's normal income tax structure. So they want to have a percentage of people who pay more based on how much they make. They want federal or state ownership of the railroads. They want revenue tariffs. They want the election of senators by popularity instead of having them be based on electoral ballots and electoral votes. So with this, they also want to have single terms for the president and the vice president. Excuse me. They want immigration restrictions, a secret ballot, and an 8-hour workday. And they only put in the 8-hour workday to try to bring people from the industrial sector in. So in about 1892, they have a strong enough base that they'll have their first national presidential candidate, whose name is James Weaver, and he's this fellow who's over here on the right. Now, this lady who's over here on the left with the weird bun on top of her head, she is an incredibly well-known populist, and she would give these kind of fiery speeches about populism and the objectives of populism and the good things about populism, despite the fact that she herself cannot vote populist. That's what she wants. Now, under James Weaver, he will receive 22 electoral votes. He will have a ton of popular votes. He'll have 1 million popular votes. He'll win the popular election, but he will lose the election altogether because he will not have enough votes in the Electoral College. And mostly, this is caused by the fact that he clashes with the Democratic Party over white supremacy. And so, by around 1896, this idea of white supremacy and the ideas of populism in general will be included into the Democratic silver movement, but it'll lose momentum. And William Jennings Bryan will take up the Progressive Party's platform, but we're not at the Progressive Party yet, and so most of this information, it's not super important to what's going on in Kentucky, but you just kind of need to know it. It's not likely to end up on the test or anything. All you really need to know is that they want to mint more silver, and silver is going by the wayside. The fact that silver hasn't been demonetized yet at this point in history is important because we're going to move off the gold standard. But before we can move off the gold standard in the Depression, we have to move off the silver standard, the silver and gold standard together. And so when they demonetize silver, you're going to have economic issues that come off of this. And there's going to be a big clash with the Democratic Party based on silver alone and the use of silver in the economy. That's really what you need to know. And that eventually most of what the populists want will come into being. Their main platform pieces, like the 8-hour work week, the immigration restrictions, things like that, those will come to pass during the Progressive era. They'll get a lot of what they want. But this movement is really popular in Kentucky, and so you'll have Thomas Pettit, who is a newspaper publisher and who runs as a populist for the candidate of governor in Kentucky, and he takes enough votes from Parker Watkins Hardin that William O. Bradley will become Kentucky's first Republican governor. So up to this point in Kentucky, there's just Democrats all the way across the board. And because this populist movement comes through, you will have the first Republican governor take over in Kentucky, in Kentucky's history. So understand that this isn't a small movement. This is a large movement, and it's mostly backed by the agrarian sections of Kentucky. So you can see essentially where the platform's base is. And then this is a national movement, but it takes a really deep root in Kentucky. And so as we move along through history, once populism kind of dies, it essentially gets moved over into progressivism. And progressivism becomes an even larger movement. So let's move on to the Black Patch War. So now that you kind of understand the economic issues that are the economic and political issues that are kind of plaguing Kentucky, we're going to go into something that kind of exacerbates this a little bit more. So with the Black Patch War, this is a conflict that involves around 30 counties in Kentucky and Tennessee, and it's between the American Tobacco Company and the Planters Protective Association, which later will protest the practice of paying deflated prices for tobacco. So the Planters Protective Association will say, okay, we are not going to pay for tobacco that we know is worth more than what it's being sold for, essentially. And the name of this company, and the name of this war, and the whole reason that we're talking about this, the name comes from a type of tobacco. There's a type of tobacco called black patch tobacco. And it's made with wood smoke and fire, and it's cured after it's harvested. And it's mainly used in pipes and snuff and as chewing tobacco. So the American Tobacco Company, in the areas where the black patch tobacco is grown, the American Tobacco Company, who's owned by James Buchanan or Buck Duke, who's from North Carolina, will buy and sell this tobacco rather than producing it himself. So this tobacco, what he'll do is he'll say, okay, I'm going to look at this area and these counties in this area that sell this tobacco, and I'm going to buy up these little tobacco farms. And as I'm buying up these little tobacco farms, I can sell it cheaper because I'm going to start manufacturing cigarettes in 1879 under Duke and Sons, W. Duke and Sons. W. Duke Sons and Company. And so they'll start manufacturing these cigarettes. Well, when James Bonsack, I hate this guy's name, James Bonsack, creates rolling machines, Duke will rent these, and this will create about 400 cigarettes per minute. That's a ton of cigarettes. And so he needs this tobacco to be able to roll all these cigarettes. And so what he'll do is he'll sell this tobacco and these cigarettes at a super low rate. And so he'll either put the tobacco farmers out of business so that he can buy the tobacco farm, or he'll just buy out the tobacco farmers and undersell tobacco at such a rate that farmers who are just doing it on a small scale can't afford to live anymore. So James Bonsack will only deal and will only produce these cigarette rolling machines to Duke. And he will do this in exchange for lowered royalties, which kind of cut manufacturing costs and will lower retail costs for the competitors. And so when he merges into the ATC, this will affect both domestic and foreign markets. So you'll have tobacco being grown in other places. It's not only affecting Kentucky, but it's deeply affecting Kentucky. So, like I said, these lowered prices for cigarettes will just absolutely devastate Kentucky tobacco growers. And so this area that's part of the Black Patch, the planters who are there and the farmers who are there will establish the Dark Tobacco District Planters Protective Association of Kentucky and Tennessee, which is essentially the Planters Protective Association, and it goes by the PPA. It'll be formed in 1904 by a fellow named Felix Ewing, and he's this little guy who's down here to the left, and he's from Adams, Tennessee, and he works by kind of taking workers and moving them away and starting some cotton sharecropping, but then he'll eventually kind of move away from that. And so by September of 1904, Ewing will host a meeting in Guthrie, Kentucky with about 5,000 people in attendance. And this meeting proposes that farmers join a protective association that will withhold tobacco from the ATC until the farmers are paid what they need to be able to survive. And so he encouraged members to bring other planters. And those who refused to join in this association will be called hillbillies, which is where the term hillbilly comes from. And usually those who don't join will be boycotted through their business somehow, or for example, let me give you an example. Let's say you have practically everybody's growing tobacco at this point. Practically everybody is a farmer of some sort or another. So let's say you've got a person who owns an ice cream parlor in small town Kentucky, and they're also growing tobacco. If they refuse to join the PPA, or they're planning on selling their tobacco to the American Tobacco Company, not only will they be called hillbillies, but that soda shop or ice cream parlor, I think I called it, people will stop going to that ice cream parlor, and can, in a lot of cases, cause that ice cream parlor to go out of business because they refuse to go to that ice cream parlor for not joining the Planters Protective Association. So what will happen is the ATC will start purchasing tobacco from non-members at higher prices. So they will essentially be bribing the planters not to join, and selling or buying their tobacco from them at much higher prices than what the local farmers can sell their crop for. So this will keep a lot of Kentucky growers from moving into this Planters Protective Association. So by 1905, this group will turn violent. And it's mainly based on the fact that Ewing becomes ill, and demands for higher prices aren't met. So it'll just kind of culminate together and will eventually spin out of control into a group called the Possum Hunters. And what these possum hunters do is they go to non-members and try to convince them to join. But they do so in a way that's mildly threatening at first, and they'll become progressively more violent over time. And they will eventually grow into what is known as the Night Riders, which is like this vigilante group. And they'll just go around and they'll start assaulting non-members and destroying their property by, burning down toll booths and burning down their tobacco barns. And, they'll throw out grass seed into the field so that the tobacco can't grow. And so it just gets more and more and more progressively violent over time. They will call themselves the Silent Brigade because they'll muffle the hooves of their horses. And they'll reach 10,000 members by 1906. So only a year later from the time that Ewing falls ill. They will raid Princeton, Hopkinsville, Russellville, and some of the villages in Crittenden County. And will go through just kind of destroying property all over the place. So they will blow up tobacco warehouses with dynamite, and they will take over public service areas like railroad stations, telegraphs, phone offices, police stations, and fire stations, and toll booths, and they'll either destroy them or they'll just take over them until they're ready to just kind of leave that area. But it will keep people from getting help. In the case that, like the warehouse they blow up. The fire station has been overtaken by them. So you can't call the fire department. You can't call the police. You can't call and get any kind of help. So they'll cut you off from any of the basic help that people can get, emergency services, to kind of help you save your product and your crop. So Lieutenant Newton Jasper Wilburn of Kentucky, of the National Guard, leads a lot of these raids. And so the leaders will be captured, and then the group will lose power. So this Newton Jasper Wilburn will go around, and he's leading raids on the Night Riders. So he will go and he'll kind of like hide himself away, and then go out and raid them in the night and say, okay, you're all under arrest. And after these members and these leaders are captured, it will just completely lose power. And so he almost single-handedly will end the Black Patch War by 1908. And so in the United States Supreme Court case, United States versus the American Tobacco Company, they will rule that the ATC is a monopoly and is in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, and will end further issues, supposedly, of this Black Patch War. But there are still some issues, but this will take care of it in 1911. So let's move on from here. I know that was really kind of complicated and convoluted, but just understand that farm prices and prices for goods, they're dropping, and they're continuing to drop, and people are getting progressively more violent in response to this. So you can see that Kentucky hasn't really ever come out of any of the panics that plagued the end of the 1800s. And so going into the 1900s, you will see just increased violence, and this will continue up until the point where we reach the Depression. So this really doesn't get any better until World War II, but we'll get to that later. So under the Progressive Era, and I'm just going to give you a very basic overview of the Progressive Era. And what this is it's just a period of widespread political reform and social activism between about 1890 and 1920. And this will deal with problems pertaining to industry, urbanization, immigration, and corruption in government, especially corruption in government. So we will see the passing of the 16th Amendment, which allows for an income tax, the direct election of senators, which is one of populists' goals, was the direct election of senators, prohibition, which will be the 18th Amendment, women's suffrage, the 19th Amendment under the Susan B. Anthony Act, which we talked about last week, social justice support, and social support in general. So we'll see Jane Addams and the settlement houses and Frances Perkins really coming into notoriety at this point. We'll find more supporters of technological advancement, highway improvement by about 1910 or so, consolidation of schools, and the improvement of teaching conditions. There will be a short panic in about 1907. Kentucky's already doing poorly economically, and this will just continue to get worse under this panic of 1907. And so we'll see more antitrust laws, tariff legislation, and currency legislation. And so if you look over here to your right, over at this picture, this is a picture of the president, and he's taking, and there's this phrase that they use called priming the pump. So what they're planning on doing is they're planning on putting a little bit of money into the economy, and so they're using that little bit of money to kind of push the economy to output more. And so, they're thinking that if they just put in a little bit of money and they'll pay as they go and those kinds of things, then the issues of the economy under the panic will go away. So as we go into World War II, this will continue to be a thought and a practice, this idea of priming the pump. Very little economic input for greater economic output. And then we'll also see this as an era of what they call muckraking. And essentially what they're doing is they're digging up political dirt and creating regulatory agencies. So if any of you guys have ever read The Jungle, it's Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. And this book, this muckraking book, by itself will lead to the creation of the FDA under Roosevelt. So let's go on to Kentucky Prohibition. And this is something that maybe comes to mind when we talk about Kentucky and Kentucky history and the effects that hit Kentucky very hard. Prohibition is particularly hard. So not only do we have issues in the farming sector and issues in the industrial sector and issues on the economic side and issues on the political side, we now have issues with prohibition. And the one thing beyond tobacco and horses that Kentucky's really known for, you've got liquor, you've got tobacco, and you've got horses, and that's pretty much all that Kentucky is nationally known for, other than violence. It's pretty well known for violence at this point. But I mean, other than that, that's really all Kentucky's got going for it at this time, as far as, trying to gain other people coming into Kentucky. So, Prohibition is supported by the temperance movement. And we had talked about a little bit about the temperance movement. I believe it was last class when we were talking about Laura Clay. So starting in about 1890, you'll see an increase in Kentuckians going through and supporting this movement, this temperance movement. And temperance is essentially just saying no alcohol. So by about 1914, you'll have 14 dry counties. Lexington will become essentially a drinking haven, and it will have about 150 saloons in 1914, but only about 97 by 1919. But this is in direct response to World War I, that they'll have this kind of decrease in the number of drinking establishments and saloons, and it's directly related to the fact that they had to protect grain for World War I. So Prohibition will take effect in January of 1920. And the bourbon areas are hit the most hard. So, you can see in these pictures over here, people will start developing stills, but at the same time, the federal government is coming in and they're pouring out liquor left and right. So people are getting really creative about how they're going to get their liquor. And this prohibition actually leads to increased consumption and binge drinking. People aren't drinking less because of prohibition. They're drinking more, and they're drinking it more quickly, is essentially what's going to happen. But it'll all be kind of extra legal, so, the government's not getting any taxes off of this. So, for the bourbon area, those places, the distilleries, are going to have a significant loss of income. There'll be break-ins, bootlegging, and speakeasies will become popular. There's not many that will hit Kentucky. It's mostly in bigger cities, but regardless, moonshining becomes just outrageously popular. But the thing about moonshining is that you've got to be really, really careful about how you process alcohol, because it can cause not only severe illness, but blindness and even death if it's not distilled correctly. But you'll have a couple of prominent bootleggers come into the Lexington area, and one of them is Isaac or Ike Miller, who will be one of these people who had like their own distillery, but they'll kind of like move away from that. And then you've got Lawrence Patrolman Percy, who was a former policeman. And so Patrolman Percy will go through and start robbing Ike Miller's distilleries, which are essentially just stills. And this will lead to a gunfight between the two of them, and they end up calling it the Battle of Jersey Street. Just based on this one little robbery, and they just kind of go back and forth, and they see each other on the streets, and they're like, I'm going to kill you. But, I don't have any good pictures of them on here. I wish I did. But you can see how, innately linked Kentucky is to liquor. And so liquor will just continually be transferred out by either train or in automobiles. And you can see down here at the very bottom, there's this car that looks like it's transporting like pieces of wood, but it's hollow on the inside. And so they'll put the liquor inside these things and kind of close it in, and they'll take liquor out that way. And liquor is getting all over the country just based on trains and automobiles. So in Kentucky and nationally, they'll establish the National Prohibition Bureau. And if you are arrested 3 times under the National Prohibition Bureau, it can lead to a felony and 1 year in prison. The only way that you can legally drink alcohol is by prescription. And I actually have a picture of the prescription template on the slide here. So prohibition will, like I said, lead to binge drinking. increase court expenditures, and it will be repealed by February of 1933 and come back into Kentucky and make a boom. So that is it for the night. Have a good night. I hope this makes sense. If you guys have any questions going into this, because I know that this is a really hard and confusing kind of time period, if you have any questions whatsoever, please make sure that you contact me. You guys only have 2 weeks before the test, and I want to make sure that you guys have a good idea of what's going on. So any questions whatsoever, just let me know. And have a good night and a good weekend, and I will see you guys next week. Bye!